Well, good evening. As you can see, I'm in a different location tonight. That's just coincidence. This is week 13 of Introduction to Composition and Research for the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. And tonight, a lot of what we'll talk about is, practically speaking, review. Next week, we'll do more actual review, and then we'll conclude the class the following week. We've talked about challenges to clear writing, and I want to do a little bit more of that tonight. Got a little bit of other information, some other thoughts to pass along, but let me go back to something that I said in a previous class, and that is that it is not possible to express every idea that you want to express, either in spoken word or on paper. It's not possible to express every idea in short sentences. Some points, some concepts are simply too complex to break down into see, Dick, run sentences, see, Spot, run, that kind of thing, Dick and Jane level sentences. So how do we handle complex concepts clearly? How do you express complex ideas on paper clearly so that readers can immediately see the mental image of your topic? Well, that's the focus of this class. I want to take you back to the Bible for a couple of illustrations of this. Take your Bible and look at Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 17. Now, in the American Standard Version, which is the late 19th century English translation of the Bible, published in 1901, the American Standard Version renders these verses, Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 17, this way. For I make known to you, brethren, as touching the gospel which was preached by me, that it is not after man. For neither did I receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came to me through revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my manner of life in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and made havoc of it, and I advanced in the Jews' religion beyond many of mine own age among my countrymen, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it was the good pleasure of God, who separated me even from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, straightway I conferred not with flesh and blood. Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them that were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and again I returned unto Damascus. Now, in those 7 verses, you have 6 verses, you have 4 sentences in the English Standard, or the American Standard Version. The English Standard has 4 sentences also, but renders it like this. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you've heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Here, I said 4 sentences. In the English Standard, you actually have 5 sentences in the translation. But notice Paul goes in this paragraph, and this is one paragraph in both editions, both versions. The Greek text did not typically break into paragraphs. But in this one paragraph, Paul goes from relatively short declarative sentences. Look at verse 12. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. When we know from verse 11 that he's talking about the gospel, then that's pretty straightforward and clear. But get down here to verse 14, verse 15 rather. Verse 15 through verse 17 is one long sentence. It has a number of clauses to it, a number of parenthetical thoughts, a number of qualifying statements. And yet, as long as you pay attention to the punctuation, it's not terribly hard to understand, is it? Take John chapter 6 and look at what is described by the Jews of Jesus' day as hard teaching. In verses 60 through 65, you likewise have about 6 verses, and yet here, roughly the same length, same number of verses, same length approximately of information. You have not 4 sentences, but 7 or 8. The English Standard Version says, when many of his disciples heard it, the things that he was teaching, they said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who those were who did not believe and who it was who would betray him. And he said, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. The longest, most complex sentence in that entire paragraph is the second half of verse 64, that parenthetical statement where he says Jesus knew from the beginning who those were who did not believe and who it was that would betray him. Some things, ideas, images, concepts are simply too complex to break down into simple sentences. Go back to Galatians chapter 1 and look at verses 15, 16, and 17, or if you're using an older translation, verses 14, 15, 16, and 17. And what do you have? There's no one single difficult sentence or clause in that long, detailed sentence. Look at what Paul says, starting at verse 15. When it was the good pleasure of God, where does the sentence actually go from there? To verse 16, to reveal his Son in me, straightway I conferred not with flesh and blood, but went away to Arabia and returned to Damascus. That's the substance of the sentence. But look at all the other information that Paul includes that qualifies it, that helps us understand not just God called me and I went to Arabia and came back to Damascus, but why and how it is that Paul is an apostle like Peter and John, not a second-class apostle, as some of the Judaizers troubling the Galatian churches were accusing him of being. What else does he tell us there? God chose me, God separated me from my mother's womb. Now, our Calvinistic and Reformed theologian friends would look at that and say, see, God didn't give him a choice. God chose him without any input of his will. But in the larger context of the Bible, we understand that God chose a class or a category of people, those who in faith would submit to his will. He didn't put everybody's name in a hat and pull it out. But Paul emphasizes that God had made it possible for him to be saved. And he called me to reveal his son so that I might do what? Preach Christ among the Gentiles. And I didn't confer with flesh and blood. I didn't go consult with anybody else, human. I didn't go to Jerusalem and consult with the apostles. He gives us all this other information. Now, could we break this down into small declarative sentences? Yes. But what would we have to do? What would Paul have had to have done to make those small declarative sentences clear? This fairly straightforward, if rather longish sentence would have ballooned into a much longer paragraph, because Paul would have to have explained each sentence as he went. By putting them all together, when you read through it with the punctuation that gives it meaning, it's long, yes. It's complex, yes. But it's actually rather clear. You've probably never heard of Jake Holmes. But Jake Holmes in his time was quite well known in his particular industry. Now let me share the screen with you for a moment. I want to play something for you. This is on YouTube. Let me get over here to the other screen. What happened to my other screen? Well, this is the wrong other screen. Give me just a moment to, here we go. Jake Holmes was a jingle writer in the advertising business in the 1960s and 70s. If you remember the Army's recruiting slogan from the 80s and the 90s, be all that you can be in the Army, he wrote that. But he also wrote this, which some of you might actually be old enough to remember.
Drink Dr. Pepper, don't you know? It's the original taste that I love so. And the taste is making peppers everywhere I go. There's greeting peppers, eating peppers, choir peppers, shire peppers. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? There's winning peppers, spinning peppers, none peppers, fun peppers. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? Be a pepper, drink Dr. Pepper.
Okay, that serves our purpose for that. Did you notice in that simple little jingle how much information was presented? Every line is a simple little direct line. What's the overall message? Be a pepper. Drink Dr. Pepper. The message is clear. They're all different kinds of peppers. And it's a cute little play on the name of the product, Dr. Pepper, which actually has nothing to do with hot peppers. But it drives the message home in a very simple, direct way. You may perhaps, if you're old enough, have heard of Richard Trent Can't read my own handwriting now. Richard Trent Legg. He too was a jingle writer. And he provided this, which you will have stuck in your memory, if it will play. There we go.
Buckle up for safety, buckle up for safety, always buckle up. Put your mind at ease, tell your riders, please get your seatbelt buckled, everybody buckle up.
The National Safety Council says if you don't have seatbelts, get them. If you do have seatbelts, use them.
All right, that serves our purpose here. What I want you to see, though, is the clarity of the message. Simple, direct. The fundamental message was clear from the beginning. Be all that you can be in the Army. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? Buckle up for safety. Now, that last jingle writer, Richard Trent Legg, probably is better known not for buckle up for safety, but for I wish I were an Oscar Mayer wiener. These men demonstrate a facility with words, an ability to convey a thought simply, directly, vividly, in a very simple, not simplistic, but a very simple way. Now, let me take you in the opposite direction. Ludwig van Beethoven, brilliant composer of symphonies, concertos, sonatas, myriads of complex musical works. And yet, we hear his music and recognize it, even if we don't know that it's by Beethoven, almost instantly. Because for all of the complexity in his music, there are themes that repeat, that move from one instrument to another, from one section of the orchestra to another, themes that repeat, that vary on the same theme over and over throughout his works, so that we hear the familiarity, the repetition. In your writing, you want that familiar theme to come through. Whether it's the simplicity of, I wish I were an Oscar Mayer wiener, or buckle up for safety, or be all that you can be, or whether it is the sometimes almost subliminal theme of a Beethoven concerto. Think about John Williams, modern day composer of movie scores and things like the score to Jaws and Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., the Extraterrestrial, and the Indiana Jones movies. In all of these, you have wildly different music, and yet common threads. Anytime you hear a cello sound the notes, da-dum, 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 dum, dum, da-dum, dum, dum. If you've seen Jaws, instantly you know what that music means. And if you've seen the movie, you understand that every time you hear that music in the movie, what is being subliminally telegraphed to you? The shark is coming. The shark is coming. I'll give you a little humorous story to go with that. When I saw Jaws for the first time as a teenager, yes, that dates me, the young man sitting beside me never made the connection between the music and the coming of the shark. And so Mark sat in the seat beside me with his feet up in the chair and jumped and gasped and shrieked every time the shark appeared on screen. He never connected the music with the shark is coming. It actually made it rather humorous to watch him during the film. Here's the point. Jingle writers don't typically write symphonies and concertos. They write things that are short, direct, obvious. Composers, their stock in trade are much larger, much more complex works. So, how do you handle a large, maybe long, complex idea like the subject of a research paper? How do you handle that on paper? Two basic points. Number one, as you write, get to the main point of the sentence early. We talked about this in a roundabout way last week. Get to the main point of the sentence early. Take Galatians chapter 1 again. Paul writes fairly short, fairly straightforward sentences in verse 11, verse 12, verse 13. Even in verse 14, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own people, my own age. But we come to verse 15. Now we have this long, complex statement. And what's the long, complex statement about? Paul tells you in the very first clause, God set me apart according to his grace. He tells you the basic point right up front. God chose me. God set me apart. He separated me. He chose me for this purpose. All right. Get to the main point early on. If you put all of the details up front, you're going to put the reader to sleep before they ever reach the main point. Let's take this same sentence and just put it in reverse. Start at verse 17. I went away into Arabia and then returned to Damascus. I didn't go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. I didn't confer with flesh and blood. He revealed his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. God called me through his grace and chose me from my mother's womb according to his good pleasure. The main point is that God chose me according to his good pleasure. But if you put it in reverse, you're going to fall asleep before you ever get to the main point. Readers unconsciously look for three basic keys to decode the meaning of every sentence. Key number one is the first word of the subject of the main clause. Well, in this case, the subject of the main clause is God's good pleasure. God. Then they look for the verb that relates to that subject. God chose, or God separated. And then they look for an object to connect to that verb. What did God choose? What did God separate? God chose me. There's the sum of this whole lengthy sentence. God chose me. Therefore, when you write, start with the subject, get quickly to the verb, and then move on to the object, the details of the verb, and do it quickly if you can. After you establish those three items, the subject, the verb, and the object, then the rest of the sentence, all of the details, all of those clauses, then the rest of the sentence can follow them. Now, let me give you a couple of examples, and these are based on the examples that Williams gives, the comparisons that Williams gives. But let me give you an example that goes back to that not clear versus clear saying the same thing that he showed us last week. The not clear version says, many new Georgia School of Preaching students drop to audit status when they realize how much coursework is required for credit. So if you are a new student, you should carefully consider whether or not you have enough time to complete all the work necessary to receive credit before signing up for a class. Okay? What's the basic subject? The basic subject is students. What's the verb? The actual verb here is consider. Students, consider. What's the object? The coursework or the requirements. Students, consider the requirements. All of the other information, audit status, credit status, how much work is necessary, all of that's not extraneous, but it's related information. Students, consider the requirements. Students, consider the coursework. Now let me see if I can express it a little bit more clearly. Before you enroll in a class for credit, you should consider whether or not you have enough time to complete the required coursework. Because many students drop to audit status when they realize everything that is required for credit. We could even simplify that a little bit by just saying before you enroll in a class, you should consider whether or not you have enough time to complete the required coursework, because many students drop to audit status when they realize everything that's required for credit. Here's the point. When you write something, revise it. After you revise it, read it and revise it again. After you have revised it the second time, read it a second time. And if you can revise it and clean it up, clear it up even more, revise it again. Now, the second part of this, part number one, when we talk about handling long, complex ideas on paper, part number one, get to the main point of the sentence early, get to the main point of the paragraph early, get to the main point of the chapter. If you're writing a chapter book, get to the main point early. Lots of the details can come after that. But here's point number two. Try to not let your sentences get fat. Now, what do I mean by fat? You want a sentence that is focused on its core. You want a paragraph that is focused on its core thought that should be expressed in one sentence. Subject, verb, object, followed by a string of clauses, if necessary, tacked onto it. Of the topics you can study that are important for accurate Bible understanding, there are few that are more helpful than hermeneutics, which deals with the basic principles of interpreting what we read, which impacts how we understand what the Bible says, which then affects how we apply the scriptures in our daily lives. All right, let's revise that. Of the topics of study that are important to accurate Bible understanding, no. If you want to understand the Bible accurately, few subjects are more helpful than hermeneutics. Hermeneutics deals with basic principles of interpretation. It helps us interpret what the Bible says. It helps us understand what the Bible says. That affects how we apply the scriptures in our daily lives. You can reduce all of those relative clauses to phrases. You can change verbs. You can go from passive to active verbs, and that eliminates excess words. And you can separate all of that into four even distinct sentences. Some principles to summarize the matter. And then we'll get on to a couple of other things related to all of this. Principle number one, avoid long introductory clauses and phrases. If you have 50 words in your first sentence of your introductory paragraph, either you are a scientist with lots of technical jargon that you need to include, or your introductory sentence can be broken down into independent clauses or even separate sentences. Number two, avoid long introductory clauses, number one. Number two, avoid long subjects, the subject of the sentence. Break it down into subordinate clauses or even separate sentences. Revise, revise, revise. But number three, don't become a comma monster. Don't tack on clause after clause after clause after clause. When you have 10 different qualifying statements after your object or between your verb and your object, when you have 3 qualifying statements between the subject and the verb, trim those clauses and break them out into separate statements, separate sentences. There's a quote on the board behind me. The structure of every sentence is a lesson in logic. John Stuart Mill was widely regarded in his own lifetime as the foremost English philosopher of the 19th century. Great thinker, great writer. His works are still studied today. Every structure, or the structure of every sentence, is a lesson in logic. That statement is true because if a well-written, accurately written image is presented, then it will be recreated in the reader's mind. as a writer, if you create an accurate image, when someone reads what you write, their mind will mirror your mind. Now, if the images don't match, either the reader didn't correctly follow your progression of thought, or the writer didn't present his thoughts in a clear, logical order. All right, let's talk briefly about the vocabulary of research writing. And this is not really new material. I've mentioned these things before, but you're getting down to the part of the class where you're working on the research paper, you're dealing with the information, you're trying to assimilate it and digest it. And some of what you read, especially if it was written 150, 200 years ago, as some commentaries, for example, were, some of what you read may be rather heavy reading, not because it's a difficult concept necessarily, but academic writers, especially in the 1800s, but even up through the middle of the 20th century, tended to write very highfalutin language. They made it hard to read sometimes. It's very precise, but it makes you work. That can bleed over into your writing, and it doesn't need to. So talking about the vocabulary of research writing, standard English is your vocabulary. Standard English, impersonal words. I, me, my, are words you don't use normally because I, the writer, am not the focus of the research. But don't use stilted language to get around using personal pronouns. If you find it necessary to say, here's what I learned about this subject, don't go around that by saying, what the writer deciphered on this was, in order to keep from saying I. I am not the focus of the research. However, you don't want to make it read like an 1890s nightmare to avoid using the word I. Standard English, normal words, normal vocabulary. Research writing uses modest words in place of dogmatic words. Let me illustrate that. Dogmatic words are the words of hyperbole. I have a preacher friend who writes excellent articles in content, in scriptural application, in train of thought. Very vivid. But I once commented to another friend about his writing that he writes in hyperbole. Everything he writes is always like this. To which my preacher friend, who was well acquainted with his writing also, commented, and he always does it. Research writing uses modest words, not dogmatic words. Everybody's doing it. Well, literally every person in the world? Many people are doing it. I'd even say most people are doing it. but that reduces the hyperbolic tone, the exaggerated tone, to a more reasonable, manageable level. That could never happen. Is it impossible, or is it very unlikely? Well, in that case, if it's very unlikely, you might say, that's unlikely to occur, or that's unlikely to happen. You might say, this seldom happens, rather than this never happens. They seldom say this. Oh, they never say that. Calvinistic writers never say, well, that's not entirely true. Calvinistic writers seldom say. Substitute modest words for hyperbolic words. Seldom instead of never, often instead of always. Academic writing, proper, good, standard English academic writing limits the use of adverbs. I didn't say that we never use adverbs, helping verbs, linking verbs, but it limits them. Is something good, or is it marvelously good? Is something fast, or is it wonderfully fast? Is something impressive, or is it splendidly impressive? If you're speaking to a live audience, you might use those adverbs in very emphatic ways. But when you're writing, demonstrating what you have learned about something, those over-the-top descriptors, over-the-top qualifiers are not necessary. Stay away when you can from formal English. Let me give you an illustration of the differences between formal, standard, colloquial, and slang to express the same idea. The standard English word would be excellent. This is an excellent thought. This is an excellent idea. This is an excellent ice cream cone, whatever. Perfectly legitimate descriptor. The formal term to substitute for excellent might be superlative. What a superlative ice cream cone. Really? The colloquial, the in between standard English and outright slang, might say, well, this is a first-rate ice cream cone. This is a first quality product. The slang term, oh, this is a cool ice cream cone. We'd ask, well, why is it cool other than it's ice cream? See, the slang term is not even, it's context dependent for actual meaning. But in research writing, pay attention to your vocabulary. Stay focused on a standard English vocabulary, not a lot of hyperbole, not a lot of formality, and avoid slang unless it's in a quotation. Avoid slang and colloquialisms like the plague. There's you a colloquialism of sorts in its own right. With respect to your paragraphs, the construction of what you write, a paragraph should be about a single topic. The length of the paragraph is determined by how much you must say about that particular topic. Now, a paragraph, particularly in recording dialogue, a paragraph can be a single sentence. And it's possible in research writing to write a one-sentence paragraph, but it's not common. A paragraph is about one topic, and everything in that paragraph needs to relate in some way to that one topic. If you have other information that relates to something else, it belongs in a separate paragraph. A paragraph that covers more than half a page or more than one screen on a normal computer is probably, not invariably, but probably too long. You probably have too much information for one paragraph. Now, you can write several paragraphs on the same subject that all relate to each other. And when you have a lot of information on one particular topic, that's how you want to present it. You want to organize it into the information on this topic that relates to itself, all of the related information, and then information on this same topic that doesn't relate to this information, but it relates to the overall topic. And then the third paragraph is other information that relates to the overall topic, but doesn't necessarily relate to the information in the first or second paragraphs. A single sentence can make up a paragraph, but it doesn't normally, except in writing dialogue. And a topic sentence expresses the main idea of the paragraph right up front. It's a reference point for everything else that follows. All right. Now I've said all that, and that brings us not quite to the halfway point of the class, time-wise. You should receive or should have received in the email, various emails, the attachments that are associated with this class, some attachments that relate back to this internet address, https://owl, OWL, .purdue.edu/OWL, the online writing laboratory. And you should have among those attachments that you can print out copies of the basic information about the Chicago Manual of Style, the Modern Language Association Formatting and Style Guide, which is the longest of these, the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, Style Guide, and pages will separate. You should also have, not from Purdue, but from, I don't have it right here in front of me, some information about the Society of Biblical Literature documentation formats as well. You can print those out and reference those, and they will be very helpful. You can also simply go to this address and find all of that information, plug in information, questions, how do I do this? How do I document that? And it will show you page by page. I'll give you one other address. I've mentioned this before, but this one, even though you have to be a little bit careful about it at times, this one will likewise give you a cross check for making sure that you're documenting and organizing information correctly for a research paper. And that is www.citationmachine.com. CITATIONMACHINE, all one word, citationmachine.com. And you can plug in, this will give you how to format in any of these formats. This course is being archived for use by future students. And it may be that the campus director who administers this course will have a preference as to the format you use. Turabian, Chicago Manual of Style, or MLA, or APA. I doubt that any of them will use SBL. For the purposes of my presentation to the students taking this in real time, I don't care which format you use. Pick one and use it consistently in your research paper. Most students under about 40, maybe 45 years old, are probably more familiar with Modern Language Association, MLA, or depending on whether or not you've gone to college, maybe APA. Those of you who are, roughly speaking, 50 years old and up are probably more familiar with Turabian, Chicago Manual of Style. It has footnotes and so forth, and a bibliography rather than works cited. The format doesn't matter for this class as long as you use one, use it correctly, and follow it consistently. That being said, you get an hour back tonight. I'll see you next week for a review.